The morning sun streamed through the airport terminal windows as Captain James walked toward his gate. After 23 years of flying commercial airliners, he could navigate any airport with his eyes closed. Today, though, he wasn't heading to the pilot's briefing room or checking flight plans. For once, he was just a regular passenger in jeans and a comfortable blue sweater, his pilot's uniform packed away in his carry-on. Gate C42, final boarding call for Flight 1867 to Denver, announced the overhead speaker. James quickened his pace slightly. Even when off-duty, he couldn't shake the habit of being punctual. 5 back-to-back international flights had left him bone-tired, with dark circles under his eyes that told the story of crossing too many time zones in too few days. But his face lit up thinking about the weekend ahead. His daughter's birthday was tomorrow, and he wouldn't miss it for the world. "Boarding pass, please," said the gate agent with a practiced smile. James handed over his phone with the digital boarding pass displayed. The agent barely glanced at him, just another middle-aged man in a sea of travelers. There was something refreshing about this anonymity. No one calling him captain, no weight of hundreds of lives in his hands. Just seat 14C on a plane someone else would fly. "Have a good flight, sir," the agent said automatically. James smiled to himself. If only she knew how many times he'd been on the other side of this exchange. The familiar smell of airplane cabin, a mix of coffee, cleaning products, and recycled air, greeted him as he stepped on board. He nodded politely to the flight attendant and made his way down the aisle, expertly navigating past passengers struggling with overhead bins. "Need a hand with that?" he asked an elderly woman trying to hoist a small suitcase above her seat. "Oh, thank you, dear," she replied with relief as James easily lifted the bag into place. Finding his seat in row 14, James settled in by the window. From this unfamiliar vantage point, he watched the ground crew finishing their preparations with a professional eye. They were doing a good job, thorough methodical checks that reminded him of his own pre-flight routines. A young man in a business suit took the aisle seat beside him, immediately pulling out a laptop. "First time flying?" the man asked, noticing how James studied the wing flaps during the taxi. James grinned. "You could say I've been on a few planes before." The businessman nodded politely before returning to his spreadsheets, unaware he was sitting next to someone who had logged over 18,000 flight hours on this exact model of aircraft. As the engines roared to life, James felt the familiar vibrations through the floor. He could tell by the sound that this was one of the newer engines, slightly quieter, with that distinctive pitch during throttle up. The pilot's announcements came through, and James listened carefully to the voice. Young, maybe a bit too eager, probably new to the captain's seat. "Good morning, folks. This is Captain Tom from the flight deck. Weather looks clear all the way to Denver today, so we're expecting a smooth ride. Flight time will be 3 hours and 42 minutes. James leaned back as the plane accelerated down the runway. He could feel the exact moment when they reached V1, the decision speed where they were committed to takeoff. Then rotation, the gentle lift as the nose wheel came up, and finally the satisfying sensation of breaking free from the ground. The plane banked slightly after takeoff, and James automatically noted the rate of climb, the bank angle, the timing of the flap retraction. Old habits. He pulled out the in-flight magazine, trying to distract himself from mentally flying the plane. "Can I get you something to drink?" the flight attendant asked when they reached cruising altitude. "Just water, thanks," James replied. As he sipped his water and gazed out at the clouds below, James felt his shoulders finally relax. 3 glorious days of family time ahead. No responsibilities except being a dad and a husband. He closed his eyes, letting the gentle hum of the engines lull him toward a much-needed nap. Little did he know that in a few hours, his peaceful journey home would turn into one of the most challenging flights of his career, not as the captain in command, but as a passenger who would have to fight to be heard. James woke with a start as his water cup rattled against the tray table. The plane had hit an air pocket, nothing unusual, but something felt off. He'd been flying long enough to sense when things weren't quite right. The vibration beneath his feet had changed, subtle, but different from the steady hum he'd fallen asleep to. He glanced at his watch. 3 hours into the flight. They should be well into their cruise phase, smooth and steady. The businessman next to him looked up from his laptop. "Bit bumpy, huh?" James nodded, his eyes drawn to the window. The wing flaps seemed normal, but the plane was flying at a slightly lower altitude than he would have chosen with those cloud formations ahead. Strange. A soft ding echoed through the cabin as the seatbelt sign illuminated. The flight attendant's voice came over the PA system, just a touch too bright. "Ladies and gentlemen, the captain has turned on the seatbelt sign due to some light turbulence ahead. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts." James buckled up automatically, but his attention was on a flight attendant hurrying down the aisle. He recognized her, Lisa, if he remembered correctly. They'd worked a Tokyo route together last year. She hadn't spotted him, but her face told him everything he needed to know. Tight smile, eyes darting to the cockpit door too frequently, movements just a bit too rushed. Cabin crew didn't get that look for light turbulence. The plane dipped suddenly, then bobbed up like a cork in water. Not catastrophic, but definitely not normal cruise flight. Several passengers gasped. A child started crying somewhere behind him. "Is this normal?" asked the businessman, knuckles white as he gripped his armrest. "Not exactly," James replied quietly. He watched Lisa whisper something to another flight attendant, their expressions grim. When she turned, their eyes met. Recognition flickered across her face, followed by something that looked suspiciously like relief. The plane shuddered again, more pronounced this time. James felt it in his bones, the distinctive vibration of an aircraft struggling to maintain stable flight. His trained ear caught the sound of the engines adjusting, working harder than they should be. Then it happened. The plane suddenly dropped, that stomach-lurching fall that felt like an elevator cable snapping. Oxygen masks deployed from the ceiling with a collective snap, dangling and swinging with the motion of the aircraft. Screams erupted throughout the cabin. "Put your mask on first, then help others," James told his seatmate calmly, following the procedure he demonstrated countless times as a captain. His movements were methodical as he secured his own mask, then helped an elderly woman across the aisle who was fumbling with hers. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, higher pitched than before. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've experienced a minor technical difficulty. As a precaution, the oxygen masks have deployed. Please remain calm and keep your seatbelts fastened. We're working to resolve the situation." James frowned behind his mask. That hesitation spoke volumes. The minor technical difficulty line was pilot speak for "something's wrong, but I don't want to cause panic." But the oxygen masks only deployed in one scenario: cabin pressure loss. There was nothing minor about that. The plane leveled somewhat, but they were definitely descending rapidly. Standard procedure for pressurization issues: get down to 10,000 feet where passengers could breathe without supplemental oxygen. Lisa appeared beside his row, steadying herself against the seats as the plane continued its shaky descent. "Sir," she said quietly, meeting his eyes meaningfully, "how are you doing?" It wasn't a casual question, it was recognition, acknowledgement. "I'm fine," James replied, his voice muffled by the mask. "But I'm guessing the flight deck isn't." She glanced around to ensure no other passengers were listening closely. "The first officer," she started, then stopped. "I shouldn't say anything." James nodded understanding. "If you need me, I'm here." Relief washed over her face, but before she could respond, the plane lurched violently to one side. A chorus of screams filled the cabin as luggage tumbled from overhead bins. This was no ordinary turbulence or controlled descent. Something was very wrong, and James knew this was just the beginning. As the plane steadied slightly, James pressed the call button. He needed to find out more about what was happening. Several minutes passed before a young male flight attendant appeared, his name tag reading Alex. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and his uniform tie hung askew. "Sir, I'm very busy right now. What can I help you with?" His voice carried the strained politeness of someone barely holding it together. James leaned forward, keeping his voice low. "I'm a commercial pilot with Pacific Airways, Captain James Mercer. I'd like to speak with your lead flight attendant about the situation." The young man's expression shifted from stress to suspicious in an instant. "Everyone's a little anxious right now, sir. I can assure you our pilots have everything under control." "I understand that," James said evenly, "but I'm actually—" "Sir," Alex cut him off, "you'd be surprised how many passengers suddenly become aviation experts during turbulence." His tone had turned dismissive. The best thing you can do is stay in your seat with your seatbelt fastened. The businessman beside James looked back and forth between them. Hey, maybe you should listen to him. He really is a pilot. Alex's tight smile never reached his eyes. Of course, sir. And I'm an astronaut on my days off. He turned back to James. Can I bring you some water? James felt his neck flush with frustration. He pulled out his wallet and extracted his airline ID. Look, I'm not trying to be difficult. I just want to help if I can. The flight attendant barely glanced at the ID. Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to remain in your seat. We have protocols for emergencies, and having passengers wandering around isn't one of them. An elderly woman across the aisle spoke up. Young man, why won't you listen? This gentleman helped me with my oxygen mask. He knew exactly what to do. Ma'am, all passengers receive safety instructions before takeoff, Alex replied, his patience clearly wearing thin. Now if you'll excuse me, I need to check on other passengers. As he turned to leave, James noticed Lisa watching from the galley area. Their eyes met briefly before she ducked back out of sight. Everyone thinks they know how to fly a plane, Alex muttered, just loud enough for James to hear as he walked away. The businessman shook his head. Well, that was something. You really a pilot? James nodded, dropping his ID back into his wallet. 23 years, and something's definitely not right with this flight. Should I be worried? The man asked, lowering his voice. Before James could answer, the plane shuddered again. The overhead bins rattled, and somewhere toward the back of the plane, a child started crying. The irregular vibration that had been bothering James grew more pronounced. Ladies and gentlemen, came the captain's voice again, sounding even more strained than before. We're continuing our descent to a lower altitude to resolve our technical issue. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened. Flight attendants, please prepare for landing. James frowned. They were nowhere near Denver yet, and prepare for landing wasn't casual phrasing. It was aviation code for prepare for potential emergency procedures. A moment later, the plane banked sharply to the left. Through his window, James could see they were changing course completely. Now he was certain they were diverting to the nearest suitable airport. As the reality of the situation sunk in, James felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to find Lisa standing in the aisle, her face pale. I overheard your conversation with Alex, she said quietly. You're Captain Mercer, aren't you? I recognize you from the Tokyo route last year. James nodded. What's happening up there, Lisa? She glanced nervously toward the cockpit. I shouldn't be telling you this, but... She lowered her voice further. The first officer is sick, really sick. Food poisoning or something. She made a retching motion. And the captain seems overwhelmed. He's asking if there are any doctors on board. James sat up straighter. Doctors? For the first officer? Lisa shook her head, her voice barely audible now. For the captain too, he's not looking good either. As if on cue, the intercom crackled to life. If there are any medical professionals on this flight, please press your call button immediately. James and Lisa exchanged a knowing look. This was about to get much worse. James unbuckled his seatbelt, his decision made. I need to get up there. Lisa placed a restraining hand on his shoulder. Wait, Alex will report me if I let you near the cockpit. Let me talk to Karen, our lead attendant. She needs to understand who you are. Before James could respond, the plane dropped again, hard enough that he could feel his body lift slightly against the seatbelt. The oxygen masks, which had stopped flowing oxygen but still dangled from the ceiling, swayed wildly. Passenger screams filled the cabin. Go, he urged Lisa. Quickly. As she hurried toward the front, James turned to his window. The plane had descended through the cloud layer now, and he could see land below. They were flying over what looked like farmland, flat, patchworked fields stretching to the horizon. They'd definitely changed course, heading south now instead of west toward Denver. The businessman beside him gripped his armrests so tightly his knuckles were white. We're going to crash, aren't we? He whispered. No, James said firmly. We're diverting to an alternate airport. It's standard procedure. But the pilots are doing their job, James finished, though he wasn't sure that was true anymore. He'd heard enough from Lisa to know the situation in the cockpit was deteriorating. A bell tone sounded, followed by another announcement. If there's a doctor on board, Please press your call button immediately. Medical emergency. The second request, more urgent than the first. James scanned the cabin, watching for call buttons. One lit up near the back. A middle-aged woman stood up, identifying herself to a passing flight attendant as a nurse. She was quickly escorted toward the front of the plane. Minutes passed, each feeling longer than the last. The plane continued its rough descent, the engines changing pitch as the pilots adjusted power. James could feel they weren't following a standard approach pattern. The turns were too sharp, the descent rate inconsistent. From his years of experience, he recognized the signs of a cockpit in crisis: the erratic control inputs, the lack of clear communication to passengers, the increasingly desperate calls for medical help. His mind ran through the possibilities. If both pilots were becoming incapacitated, food poisoning perhaps, or some kind of toxic fumes in the cockpit, the situation was dire. Most passengers had no idea how bad things were getting. They saw turbulence, felt fear, but remained ignorant of the true danger. James knew better. Without qualified pilots, this plane wouldn't land safely. Period. Lisa reappeared, her face ashen. The first officer is completely out of commission. The captain's fighting to stay conscious while flying the plane. The nurse is with them now, but she shook her head. Karen wants to talk to you. James stood immediately. The businessman grabbed his arm. Where are you going? To help, James replied simply. As he followed Lisa toward the front, he could feel eyes on him. Some passengers looked confused, others hopeful, as if they sensed he might have answers. The plane banked again, causing James to brace himself against the seats as he moved forward. In the forward galley, a stern-faced woman in her 50s, Karen he presumed, stood with her arms crossed. Her expression was a mix of skepticism and desperation. Lisa says you're a commercial pilot, she said without preamble. James nodded, producing his ID again. Captain James Mercer. Pacific Airways. 23 years of experience, 12 on this exact aircraft model. Karen studied his ID carefully, then looked him in the eye. The situation is bad. Captain Wilson is struggling to maintain control, and First Officer Chen is completely incapacitated. They both ate the fish meal. A classic scenario, James thought grimly. There was a reason pilots were supposed to eat different meals. The nurse says it looks like severe food poisoning. We're diverting to Kansas City, but Karen's professional demeanor cracked slightly. The captain's fading fast. He's asking if there are any pilots on board. Through the galley window, James caught a glimpse of the cockpit door. It was slightly ajar, and he could see movement inside. Someone hunched over, likely the sick first officer. The plane suddenly pitched nose down, steeper than any normal descent. Passengers screamed. Coffee pots crashed to the floor. The sensation of falling was unmistakable. Karen looked at James, no trace of skepticism left. We need you in there. Now. James straightened his shoulders. After being dismissed and ignored, his moment had come. Let's go. Karen punched a code into the cockpit door keypad, her fingers trembling slightly. The lock clicked, and she pushed the door open. James stepped into a scene of barely controlled chaos. The smell hit him first, the unmistakable sour odor of sickness. The first officer was slumped in his seat, a small waste bag clutched in his hands, his face ghostly pale. A middle-aged woman in civilian clothes, the nurse, was beside him, checking his pulse. In the captain's seat, a young man with sweat-soaked hair was gripping the controls. Captain Wilson couldn't have been more than 30, probably a recent promotion to captain. His eyes were glassy, his movements sluggish as he fought to keep the aircraft stable. Captain Wilson, Karen said, raising her voice over the cockpit alarms. This is Captain Mercer. He's offered to help. Wilson turned, relief washing over his face when he saw James. Thank God, he said, his voice weak. I don't know how much longer I can. He didn't finish the sentence. Instead, he lurched forward suddenly, and the nurse rushed to his side with another waste bag. The autopilot keeps disengaging. Wilson managed between heaves. Something's wrong with the hydraulic system. Manual control only. James surveyed the instrument panel quickly. Multiple warning lights glowed red. The altitude indicator showed they were at 15,000 feet and descending rapidly. The heading indicator was spinning as the plane drifted off course. I've got this, James said, moving toward the first officer's empty seat. Keep fighting, Captain. We'll get through this together. The nurse looked up at James. Both of them have severe food poisoning. The first officer is completely dehydrated, and the captain isn't far behind. James nodded as he settled into the seat, automatically reaching for the headset. This wasn't how he planned to spend his day off, but 23 years of training had prepared him for exactly this moment. Kansas City approach, this is Pacific Airways 1867, he said into the microphone, his voice calm and professional. Declaring a medical emergency. Both pilots suffering severe illness. I am Captain James Mercer, commercial pilot license number 45,872, taking position as first officer. The response was immediate. Pacific 1867, we copy your emergency. You are cleared for priority landing on runway 19 liters. Emergency services standing by. Current winds 270 at 15 knots. James's hands moved across the controls with practiced ease. Karen, I need you to make an announcement. Tell passengers we're making an emergency landing in Kansas City in approximately 20 minutes. Ask them to review safety cards and prepare for landing. Karen nodded and left the cockpit. The nurse stayed, monitoring both sick pilots. James turned to Captain Wilson, who was fighting to stay conscious. Captain, I'm going to need your help for as long as you can give it. Can you still operate the radio while I handle the flight controls? Wilson nodded weakly. I'll try. Good man, James said, then pointed to various instruments. Talk to me about these warnings. When did the hydraulic issue start? As Wilson explained the cascade of system failures, James began working methodically through the emergency checklists stored in his memory. His hands moved with confidence over the unfamiliar controls, unfamiliar only in that they weren't his usual aircraft, but the layout was nearly identical to planes he'd flown for years. The nurse watched him with growing amazement. You really know what you're doing. James managed a small smile. I should hope so. Outside the cockpit window, the clouds had given way to a clear view of the ground below. James could see the sprawl of Kansas City in the distance, the airport just becoming visible on the horizon. Pacific 1867, descend and maintain 7,000 feet, vectors for runway 19 liters, came the air traffic controller's voice. Descending to 7,000, Pacific 1867, James responded, adjusting the controls. Captain Wilson leaned over suddenly, grabbing a waist bag again. When he straightened, his face was even paler than before. I need to tell you something, he said, his voice barely audible now. The hydraulic failure, it's affecting the landing gear system. The indicators are showing inconsistent readings. We might not have full gear extension. James felt a chill run through him. An emergency landing was one thing. An emergency landing with potentially failed landing gear was entirely another. The lives of everyone on board now truly rested in his hands. Understood, he said calmly, not betraying the gravity of this new information. We'll handle it, Captain, one problem at a time. As the skyline of Kansas City grew larger in the windshield, James took a deep breath. This was going to be the landing of his career, and he wasn't even supposed to be flying today. Kansas City Airport, 12 o'clock, 20 miles, James announced, his eyes fixed on the approaching runway. Captain Wilson nodded weakly beside him, fighting to stay conscious long enough to help with the landing. The instrument panel continued to flash warnings about the hydraulic system. Outside, dark storm clouds were gathering to the west of the airport, another complication they didn't need. Pacific 1867, be advised we're showing weather moving in from the west. Recommend expediting your approach, the air traffic controller's voice crackled through the headset. Copy that, Kansas City. We're dealing with possible landing gear issues as well. Request emergency vehicles standing by, James replied. Already done, Pacific 1867. You're cleared to land runway 19 liters. Winds now 290 at 18 knots, gusting to 25. James turned to Captain Wilson. I'm going to try to cycle the landing gear manually. Can you handle the controls for a moment? Wilson nodded, though his hands trembled as they took the yoke. James dropped to his knees, pulling up the floor panel that concealed the manual landing gear release. After 23 years of flying, he knew exactly where to find it, even on his day off. The nurse continued to monitor the first officer who had fallen unconscious. His pulse is stable but weak, she reported. James found the manual release handle and pulled it firmly. A grinding sound came from beneath the plane, better than no sound at all. He climbed back into his seat and checked the indicator lights. 2 green, 1 still red. The nose gear and right main gear were down and locked. The left main gear remained uncertain. "We've got 2 green, 1 red," he told Wilson, taking back the controls. "Better than I expected." Karen returned to the cockpit. "Passengers are secured for landing. We've moved some people from the left side of the aircraft, just in case." James nodded appreciatively. Good thinking. The aircraft was now 15 miles out, beginning its final approach. James could see the runway clearly ahead, emergency vehicles already positioned along its length, lights flashing. This was the moment that would test everything he knew about flying. "I need to focus now," James said. "Karen, please return to your position. Captain, if you can stay with me for radio communications, that would be helpful." Karen squeezed his shoulder briefly before leaving. "We trust you," she said simply. As the plane descended through 5,000 feet, James felt an odd sense of calm. This was what he'd trained for his entire career. Every simulator session, every emergency drill, every difficult landing in bad weather, all of it had prepared him for this moment. Pacific 1867, wind shift reported. "Now 310 at 22 knots, the controller advised. "Copy that," Wilson responded, his voice barely audible now. James adjusted their approach path, compensating for the crosswind. The plane bucked in the turbulent air. Through the cockpit window, he could see the first bands of rain sweeping across the airport. 3,000 feet, James called out, following standard procedures even in this unusual circumstance. The hydraulic pressure gauge continued to drop. James knew they'd have limited control surface authority and possibly only 1 shot at landing. No go-around option with these systems failing. 2,000 feet. In the cabin behind them, 146 passengers and 5 crew members were bracing for landing, unaware of just how precarious their situation had become. James thought briefly of his family waiting for him at home, his daughter's birthday tomorrow. He pushed the thought away, focusing entirely on the task at hand. 1,000 feet. The rain intensified, sheets of water obscuring the windshield. The wipers struggled to keep up. James switched on the landing lights, their beams cutting through the downpour. 500 feet. The runway threshold passed beneath them. James began the flare maneuver, gently raising the nose to slow their descent rate. The plane shuddered in a gust of wind. 200 feet. He could feel the left wing wanting to drop, the effect of the uncertain gear position and failing hydraulics. James countered with right aileron, fighting to keep the wings level. 100 feet. Captain Wilson was silent now, either unconscious or simply conserving his remaining strength. It didn't matter. James was in complete control, his movements precise and confident. 50 feet, 40, 30. The right main gear touched down first with a screech of rubber on wet concrete. James held the left wing up as long as possible, then let it settle gradually. There was a horrible scraping sound as the left gear, partially extended, made contact with the runway. Sparks flew past the window. The plane lurched to the left, but James was ready, countering with full right rudder, keeping them on the centerline through sheer force of will. "Come on, baby," he whispered to the aircraft as they decelerated through the rain. Just a little longer. Gradually, the speed bled off. The scraping continued, but they were staying upright, staying on the runway. Fire trucks raced alongside them, foam cannons at the ready. And then, finally, they were slow enough. The plane came to a complete stop, 2/3 of the way down the runway. For a moment, there was complete silence in the cockpit. Then the radio erupted with the controller's voice. "Pacific 1867, excellent landing. Emergency services approaching your position now." James let out a long breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He'd done it. Against all odds, with failing hydraulics, uncertain landing gear, and terrible weather, he'd brought the plane down safely. And he'd done it all on what was supposed to be his day off. The cabin erupted in applause as Karen's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have landed safely at Kansas City International Airport. Please remain in your seats with your seat belts fastened while emergency crews assess our aircraft." James sat back in the first officer's seat, his hands still gripping the controls, adrenaline coursing through his body. Outside, emergency vehicles surrounded the plane, their lights painting the rainy tarmac in flashes of red and blue. Medical teams boarded first, rushing to the cockpit. 2 paramedics immediately attended to Captain Wilson and the first officer, while a third checked James. "I'm fine," he insisted, waving away the blood pressure cuff. "Take care of them." The paramedic nodded, turning her attention to the 2 sick pilots. Captain Wilson had regained consciousness but was too weak to stand. The first officer remained out cold as they carefully moved him onto a stretcher. "You saved our lives," Wilson whispered to James as paramedics prepared to wheel him out. "I couldn't have landed this plane. Not in that condition, not with those failures." James squeezed his shoulder. "You did good, Captain. You fought all the way." As the medical team evacuated the pilots, James remained in the cockpit, completing the shutdown procedures that the others couldn't. His body moved on autopilot, flipping switches and turning dials. 23 years of muscle memory taking over. A man in a suit appeared at the cockpit door, the airport's operations manager. "Captain, we need to evacuate the passengers. Fire crews report smoke from the left landing gear area." James nodded, picking up the intercom. His voice was steady as he made the announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Mercer speaking. We need to evacuate the aircraft immediately as a precaution. Please leave all belongings behind, follow crew instructions, and proceed to the nearest exit. Slides will be deployed. Remember to remove high-heeled shoes and jump feet first. Thank you for your cooperation." The evacuation proceeded smoothly. From the cockpit window, James watched as passengers slid down the emergency chutes into the waiting arms of rescue personnel. Rain continued to fall, soaking everyone, but no one seemed to mind. They were alive. Karen appeared at the door. "Everyone's out except for us. Time to go, Captain." As they walked through the empty cabin, James saw the businessman from seat 14D. He was standing at the exit door, helping others. "I stayed to help," he explained when he saw James. "Figured you could use another set of hands." "Thank you," James said, genuinely moved. The 3 of them were the last to evacuate, sliding down into the rainy afternoon. On the tarmac, passengers huddled under blankets provided by emergency services. Many recognized James from the flight, reaching out to shake his hand or pat his back as he passed. An elderly woman grabbed his arm. "You're the gentleman who helped me with my oxygen mask," she said, her eyes bright with tears. "The young attendant wouldn't listen to you, but I knew you were special." The irony wasn't lost on James. He'd gone from being dismissed as just another nervous passenger to being hailed as a hero in the span of 3 hours. News crews had already arrived, cameras rolling as officials briefed them on the emergency landing. A reporter spotted James and hurried over, microphone extended. "Sir, we understand you're the off-duty pilot who landed this plane. How does it feel to have saved 151 lives today?" James paused, uncomfortable with the sudden attention. "I just did what I was trained to do," he said simply. "The real heroes are the cabin crew who kept everyone calm and the air traffic controllers who cleared our way." Despite his modesty, the story spread quickly. By evening, video clips of the smoking aircraft on the runway were playing on news channels nationwide, along with interviews of grateful passengers describing how an off-duty pilot had saved the day. Back at the terminal, after giving his statement to airline officials and the FAA, James finally had a moment alone. He pulled out his phone and called home. "Hey, it's me," he said when his wife answered. "I'm going to be a little late. Had a bit of an adventure on my flight." "I know," she replied, her voice shaking slightly. "You're all over the news. Are you really okay?" "I'm fine," he assured her, "just ready to come home." 2 days later, back on regular duty, James walked through the terminal in his captain's uniform. A young flight attendant, Alex, from the emergency flight, spotted him and froze, recognition and embarrassment washing over his face. James could have walked past, could have held a grudge over being dismissed so rudely when he tried to help. Instead, he stopped. "Good morning," he said warmly, extending his hand. "Looks like we're working together today." Alex shook his hand, red-faced. "Captain Mercer, I'm so sorry about." James cut him off with a smile. "First rule of aviation. We learn from our mistakes and move forward. Besides, he added with a wink, you never know who's sitting in 14C.